Imagine this. You are 13 years old. You have never been to prom. You have never stayed up past midnight watching movies with friends. You have never had the luxury of a bad hair day without the entire country noticing. Now imagine walking into one of the most prestigious sports arenas on the planet, with millions of eyes locked onto your every move, with cameras tracking you like prey, with an entire nation holding its breath, not rooting for you as a child, but demanding you perform like a machine. Imagine winning, then winning again, then again, and instead of joy, you feel something cold creeping into your chest. Something nobody warned you about. Something that feels dangerously close to emptiness. Now imagine that same world, the one that crowned you a goddess at 13, turning on you the moment you crack. Not asking why, not reaching out, just turning its back and writing your obituary while you are still alive. This is not a fairy tale. This is not fiction. This is the true story of Jennifer Capriati, a girl who was handed everything the world promised would make her happy, and yet nearly destroyed by it all before she was old enough to vote. What you are about to hear is not just a tennis story. It is a story about childhood that was stolen in plain sight. About a prodigy crushed under the weight of a dream she never actually chose. About a human being who fell so far that the world gave up on her, and then did something no one expected. She got back up. Stay with me, because what happens next will change the way you look at fame, pressure, and what it truly means to survive. She was born in 1976 in New York City into a family that carried the weight of immigrant ambition. Her father, Stefano Capriati, was an Italian-American man who believed with every fiber of his soul that his daughter was meant to be a legend. Not just a good player, not just an athlete, a name that would echo through history. And that belief, as fierce and as loving as it may have been, became the invisible chain that would define every single day of Jennifer's childhood from the moment she could hold a racket. The family relocated to Florida, which was then the center of American tennis. This was not just a move. It was a declaration. It was Stefano saying to the world, and to his daughter, that ordinary life was no longer an option. From that point forward, Jennifer's mornings began before the sun had fully risen. Her days were built on repetition, discipline, and relentless drilling until her wrists ached and her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Her afternoons stretched into evening and movement drills. And her evenings were not for rest, not for childhood, not for play. They were for her father reviewing every mistake, every missed shot, every fraction of a second where she was not good enough. Stefano was not just a father in the traditional sense. He was her coach, her manager, and the architect of her entire existence. He decided which tournaments she would enter, who she would speak to, how she would think about victory and defeat. In his world, there was no space for hesitation. There was no space for a regular kid's life. And Jennifer grew up accepting this, not because she understood it, but because when you are that young and that immersed in a single world, you genuinely do not know another one exists. You believe this is simply what life is. You believe everyone grows up this way. You believe the exhaustion is normal, the expectations are normal, the constant pressure to be perfect is simply what it means to be alive. She never had afternoons hanging out after school. She never had slow mornings without a schedule. She never had the mercy of making a mistake without it being analyzed and cataloged. Every shot she took carried someone else's expectations. Every match she played was a referendum on her worth as a human being. And the most heartbreaking part of all of it was that Jennifer never had the chance to decide if this was what she wanted. No one asked. Because when you begin a journey like this at such a young age, the question never even gets raised. The path is already laid. The destination is already chosen. And all you can do is run. Then came 1990. Jennifer Capriati was 13 years old. 13. And she walked into the French Open, one of the most demanding Grand Slam tournaments in the sport. And she did not just compete. She shocked the planet. She marched through opponents who were older, stronger, more experienced, and more seasoned, all the way to the semifinals. The youngest player in the history of the tournament to reach that stage. Commentators could not find words fast enough. American newspapers scrambled to put her name on front pages. She was called a phenomenon, a prodigy, the future of American tennis, the girl who was going to change everything. And from that moment, Jennifer Capriati was no longer a child. She had become a symbol. And symbols do not get to be tired. Symbols do not get to feel empty after a victory. Symbols do not get to sit in a hotel room alone at night and wonder why winning feels so hollow. But that is exactly what was happening. Behind every camera flash, behind every press conference, behind every sponsorship deal that followed one after another like a parade, Jennifer was just a child who had not yet had the time to understand why she was standing in the middle of all of this. She answered the press because she had to. She controlled her image because she had to. She became the person the public expected because there was no room to be anyone else. And the loneliness of that. The specific loneliness of being surrounded by thousands of people and still feeling completely invisible. That is something nobody was writing about. Nobody was asking her about. Nobody even thought to wonder about. Because from the outside, what was there to worry about? She was winning. She was famous. She was on the covers of magazines. She had everything. Everything except a childhood. Then came 1992. Jennifer was 16 years old, and she was representing the United States at the Summer Olympics in Barcelona. The entire country was watching. Not casually, intensely. With the kind of collective holding of breath that happens when a nation decides it has placed its hope in one person. And Jennifer, with a composure that went far beyond anything you would expect from a teenager, dismantled opponent after opponent. She defeated Steffi Graf, one of the greatest players who had ever lived, at the peak of her powers. She defeated Arantxa Sanchez Vicario, a fighter of the highest order. And she stood in that final, and she won. Olympic gold. At 16 years old, the whole of America erupted. The media called her the new queen of tennis. Brands lined up for her. Doors that had never opened for anyone swung wide open for her. And in that quiet hotel room afterward, with no more cheers, no more camera flashes, no more stadium roar, Jennifer sat alone, holding a gold medal. And instead of feeling complete, she felt something she could not name. A fatigue that went so much deeper than physical. An emptiness that lived underneath all the praise. A growing, quiet awareness that the life she was living had never truly been her choice. That every step, every victory, every single title had been decided for her long before she was old enough to have an opinion about it. And that feeling, the feeling of being trapped inside a brilliant dream that someone else designed, that feeling began to grow. Slowly at first. Quietly. The way a crack in a wall grows. Invisible until suddenly it is not. Because what happens when a child is given the world's attention before she has had the chance to understand who she actually is? What happens when every moment of her life is watched and judged and measured? What happens when she has no real friends, no real private space, no real freedom to simply make a mistake and laugh it off? What happens when even her failures become headlines? The golden cage. That is what fame became for Jennifer. Beautiful on the outside, suffocating on the inside. She could not walk without cameras following her. She could not live a day without feeling observed. Relationships became impossible to navigate because she could never tell who was genuinely drawn to her and who was drawn to the name. She learned to withdraw. Not because she wanted isolation, but because it was the only defense she had. And that withdrawal only fed the loneliness, which fed the emptiness, which fed something darker that was slowly building underneath the surface of every smile she showed the world. And then in 1993, when Jennifer was 17 years old, it broke open. Not on a big court, not under stadium lights, but in a small, ordinary store in Florida, where she was caught stealing a ring. A ring of almost no monetary value. An impulse act that in most people's lives would be a minor embarrassment, a lesson learned, a story told years later at dinner. But Jennifer Capriati was not most people. And the world that had placed her on a pedestal did not treat it like a minor embarrassment. The headlines were brutal. Fallen prodigy. Failed symbol. National tragedy. Overnight, the girl America had crowned was being publicly executed in print. And nobody, not one voice in that entire chorus of judgment, stopped to ask why. Nobody looked at the years of pressure and said, this is what happens when a child carries too much too early. Nobody traced the thread from the sleepless training mornings to the empty hotel rooms to this moment in a small Florida store. They only saw a broken image. And they responded the way the world so often does when someone it loved disappoints it. They turned their backs. And then, as if to confirm every terrible thing they were writing, 1 year later Jennifer was arrested again. This time for marijuana use in a hotel. And if the first incident had been a shock, the second became a verdict. The press did not just report it. They used it. They built a narrative of irreversible collapse. They called it a national tragedy. They said the prodigy had wasted everything. They told the world that Jennifer Capriati was now a warning, a cautionary tale, proof of what happened when someone reached too high too fast. She left tennis. There was no announcement, no press conference, no goodbye. She simply disappeared from the courts that had been her entire world since she was a child. And the silence that followed was the world concluding that her story was over. Done. Finished. But inside that silence, inside those years that the cameras stopped caring about, something entirely different was happening. Because Jennifer Capriati was still alive. And she was still fighting, just not in a way anyone could watch or measure or rank. The depression came in like fog. Slow and total. Days without structure. Nights without sleep. A feeling of floating through time with no anchor, no goal, no reason to move in any particular direction. She had spent her entire life being defined by tennis, shaped by it, identified by it, and now without it, she genuinely did not know who she was. If you take away the only identity a person has ever had, what is left? That question did not have an easy answer for Jennifer. It barely had an answer at all. She once said, and I want you to really hear this, she once said that there were times she did not know who she was if she was not a tennis player. That is not a quote of self-pity. That is a quote of devastating honesty from someone who had never been given the chance to discover any other version of herself. When you grow up inside one single role, one single expectation, one single purpose, and then that purpose vanishes, you are not left with freedom. You are left with nothing. The years passed. The world moved on. Newer stars rose. Jennifer became a footnote in conversations about wasted talent, a name used as a warning. And in that silence, in that isolation, something very slow and very fragile began to grow. She started to think about the courts, not about winning. Not about trophies or rankings or what the press would say. She thought about how it felt to hit the ball. The feeling of movement, of presence, of being alive in a way she had not felt since she walked away. She returned to training. Quietly. Without announcement. The shots were not sharp. The movement was not what it had been. Her body had weakened, and her mind was still carrying wounds that had not come close to healing. And every time she stepped onto the court, she had to face the past all over again. The people who doubted her did not stay quiet. Experts went on television and said openly that a comeback was impossible. That the game had passed her. That someone who had collapsed the way she had would never be mentally stable enough to compete at the top. Those were not just professional opinions. Those were public sentences being handed down. She lost matches. She struggled. She faced empty stands and cold silences where there had once been roaring applause. There were days she wondered if she was chasing a ghost. Whether the person she was trying to return to had ever really existed at all. or whether she had simply been a projection of what everyone else needed her to be. But she kept going, not because she was certain, not because she had a guarantee. She kept going because the court was the only place left where she felt like herself, the only space where the noise in her head quieted enough to let her breathe. And then the Australian Open in 2001. Jennifer Capriati stepped into that tournament not as a triumphant return, but as a question mark, a name from the past, a story most people thought they already knew the ending to. She was 24 years old, and the road to get there had taken nearly a decade of darkness. Every round she won was not just a scoreline. It was a conversation with every person who had ever written her off. Every match she fought through was a response to every cold headline from 1993. Every point she earned was proof that the quiet years had not destroyed her. They had rebuilt her. She reached the final. She faced Martina Hingis, the world number one, the symbol of everything modern and dominant in women's tennis at that moment. And the contrast was stunning. One side the undisputed peak, the other side a woman trying to bring something back from the dead. Jennifer Capriati won that match. She won the Australian Open. And when it was over, she did not simply raise her arms and smile for the cameras. She cried. Not the kind of tears that come with a happy ending. The kind of tears that come from 10 years of pain finally having somewhere to go. From the nights she sat alone wondering who she was. From the mornings she laced up her shoes knowing nobody believed in her. From every word that had said she was finished. All of it released in that single moment on that court in Melbourne. That was not just a win. That was survival made visible. And she did not stop. Later that same year, Jennifer walked into the French Open, the tournament where her story had first exploded into the world's consciousness more than a decade earlier, and she won it. She won the French Open. And not long after, with titles accumulating and ranking points building, Jennifer Capriati rose to the world number one position. Number one. The girl the world had called a national tragedy. The woman the experts had said was too broken to compete. The person who had sat in a hotel room with a gold medal feeling utterly hollow. She was now the best women's tennis player on the planet. And then she won a second Australian Open title in 2002. She was not done. She was not a one-season story. She had genuinely returned. But the body remembers everything it was asked to do. And Jennifer's body, which had been pushed from the age of 13 through a level of physical demand that most adults never experience in their lives, began to speak loudly. Her shoulder tightened. Her wrists, the same wrists that had produced those razor-sharp forehands and backhands that entire stadiums had gasped at, became stiff and painful. Her knees ached with every explosive movement. The years were presenting their bill. And that is one of the cruelest parts of this entire story. She had sacrificed her childhood to develop a body capable of performing at the highest level. And then the very body she had sacrificed so much to build began breaking down when she had finally earned the right to enjoy what it could do. Injuries followed injuries. Form declined. Every match became a dual competition. One against the opponent across the net, and one against the pain she was managing with every step. She fought through it, because that is what she had always done. But eventually, in her mid-20s, the decision arrived. Not as a dramatic moment, just as a quiet recognition that the chapter had reached its natural end. She left tennis the second time not in disgrace, but in exhaustion. Physical and emotional and spiritual exhaustion. The kind that accumulates over a lifetime of giving too much of yourself before you understood what you were giving. And the years that followed were hard in a different way. The fame was gone. The structure was gone. The identity that had been built brick by brick since before she was a teenager was gone. What remained were the wounds, the memories, and the enormous question of who Jennifer Capriati actually was when none of the external things were present to define her. In 2010, Jennifer was hospitalized following an overdose. The press covered it the way the press always covered her. Loudly, superficially, without genuine interest in the human being at the center of the story. What they missed, what they almost always missed with Jennifer, was the context. This was not a random stumble by a careless person. This was the accumulated weight of decades arriving all at once. This was the price of a stolen childhood finally presenting itself in full. This was what happens when a human being is asked to carry more than any human being should carry, and is never given the proper support to process what that costs. But even here, in what looked like the absolute lowest point, Jennifer did not disappear. She did not surrender. She got help. She did the slow, painful, deeply unglamorous work of healing. Not for an audience. Not for a comeback story. Not for headlines. For herself. Day by day. Conversation by conversation. A gradual, quiet rebuilding of the person who had been buried under decades of pressure and expectation and public judgment. She learned how to value herself outside of results. She learned how to feel the worth of a day that did not produce a victory. She learned that her story was not defined by the ugliest moments the world had chosen to focus on, but by the full, complicated, resilient arc of a life that had survived things most people will never have to face. And the world, finally, began to reckon with that. In 2012, Jennifer Capriati was inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. Not just for the titles, not just for the Grand Slams or the Olympic gold or the world number one ranking, but for all of it. The whole story. The rise and the fall and the return. The darkness and the survival. The quiet years and the loud ones. The complete and irreducible human being behind the name. Jennifer Capriati's story changed the conversation around young athletes in professional sports in a way that persists today. Parents began to ask harder questions about how early was too early. Coaches began to reckon with the line between developing talent and consuming a childhood. Sports organizations started looking more seriously at the mental health of young competitors who were being pushed into spotlight and pressure before their nervous systems were fully formed. She showed the world something it had not expected to see from a girl who had been written off as a cautionary tale. She showed the world that survival is its own form of greatness. That the ability to stand up after the entire world sits down on you is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the hardest things a human being can do. And she did it. Not perfectly. Not without setbacks. Not without pain that she carries still. But she did it. There is a version of Jennifer Capriati's story where the chapter that begins in 1993 is the last chapter. Where the arrests define the person. Where the lost years confirm the verdict of the headlines. Where she becomes, permanently, the girl who wasted her gift. But that is not her story. Her story is one of a child who was never given a fair start. A teenager who was handed a spotlight that would have overwhelmed most adults. A young woman who collapsed under the weight of a dream she had not chosen. And then slowly, without applause, without a crowd watching, a person who chose herself, who found her way back, who refused to let pain be the period at the end of her sentence. Some people are remembered for their victories. Jennifer Capriati will be remembered for something far harder to earn than a victory. She will be remembered for getting back up. Every single time. When nobody believed she would. When nobody thought it was possible. When the cameras had stopped recording and the stadiums were empty and the only thing left was her, and a decision about what to do next. She chose to keep going. And that is the part of Jennifer Capriati's story that deserves to be carried forward. Not as a warning, not as a tragedy, but as proof. Proof that a human being who has been through the worst kind of pressure, the worst kind of public failure, the worst kind of loneliness, that human being can still find their way back to themselves. Can still build something real and lasting from the ruins of what was taken from them. Can still leave behind something that matters. Jennifer Capriati is not defined by the girl the world tried to destroy. She is defined by the woman who survived it. And sometimes, that is the only kind of story worth telling.